Okay, so welcome everyone. Hang on a second. Okay, welcome, and thank you all for being here. It's great to see you all, and I hope everyone is doing well. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Gloria Palmer. I'm the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. We are still in uncertain times, and so we continue to do most of our programming online, all of our programming actually, on Zoom, and it seems to be working well. As we've seen people coming in, everybody seems to have a different way of being able to view people, and that's kind of an ongoing learning process. This certainly is not like seeing you all in person, but I'm grateful for this technology that we can continue our work, fulfilling our mission and staying connected to you. Your safety is important to us, and so we continue to Zoom. As I said, I've muted everyone, and the reason for that is to avoid any distractions from a ringing phone, a barking dog, background noise, etc. For the Q&A portion of this presentation, there is a chat feature where you can type in your questions, and I will serve as moderator and read the questions aloud to Matt. If you are seeing a bunch of boxes with the audience members, then you are in gallery view. And depending on what device you're using, there should be somewhere on your screen that reads speaker view. If you click that, then it will change the screen so that you can see whomever is speaking, and that will be either me or Matt, and we'll be prominent on the screen. I would suggest that's the best way to do this presentation. So just a few quick announcements. Hang on a second, I'm going to bring up my slides. We are truly grateful for the support of people like you who participate in our programs, and for those of you who make a tax-deductible donation. We also have our business community who are sponsors, and I would just like to highlight 3 of our platinum level sponsors. We have Equinox Terrace, Finn & Stone Insurance, and Southwestern Vermont Healthcare. And then next Tuesday, we'll have Allison Stanger with us from Middlebury College. Her talk is Whistleblowers, Sustaining Democracy in America Since 1778. Her talk will analyze a range of whistleblowing episodes from the time of the Revolutionary War to the present, a bit of history and a bit of current events. She has written a book, and you can purchase that book at Northshire Bookstore. We have a full summer of lectures and workshops happening on Zoom. And for more information, please visit our website. This evening's presenter is Matt Dickinson, and we are very happy to have him back with us again. Matt is a professor of political science at Middlebury College. Previously, he taught at Harvard University, where he also received his doctorate in government. He writes a blog on presidential power. He is the author of Bitter Harvest, FDR, Presidential Power and the Growth of the Presidential Branch. And he has published numerous articles on the presidency, presidential decision-making, and presidential advisors. Welcome, Matt, and thank you for being our guest this evening.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, everybody. It's good to see you again, even if it's virtual as opposed to being in person. I also want to thank the Green Mountain Academy for continuing these series of talks at a time when it's easy to lose sight of the need to stay connected to people and stay connected to what's happening in current events. So I thank you, and I thank all of you for attending. I encourage you to take a beverage out of your favorite. It is the cocktail hour. We normally can't do this when we're in person, so this is one of the advantages of being in your own home or wherever you are. So it may make the talk make a little more sense, depending on what's in your beverage. What I'm going to do today is slightly different than what I normally do. Those of you who have attended my talks before, I tend to present a forecast of the presidential election every 4 years. Gloria or somebody trots me out. And I draw on political science research to try to make some generally accurate, although not entirely accurate, forecasts about presidential elections. And I always preface it by saying among political events, presidential elections are perhaps the most studied in American politics and the most widely understood, at least from a political science perspective. This is unusual times, and as a result, the forecasts that I'm going to present are much more tentative. And so rather than spending the whole time talking about those, I'm going to try to provide some context for the 2020 election by in part showing you a travel log, what I've been doing the last year and a half. And again, this will involve some slides that'll take you through the recent past, the presidential nominating process, focusing on the democratic process where all the excitement was. In my talk today, I'm going to start by providing context for how Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination. And I'll take you through the road trip, some highlights and lowlights of my trips to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and I'll talk a little bit about what I saw on those campaign events, and then draw back and talk a little bit about a couple of important factors here that I think explain why Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee. And those will focus on two factors in particular that I think are important to understand as we head into the general election. One is the importance of race, in particular, Bernie Sanders' inability to draw support from African Americans and to a lesser extent from Latinos. Second, what is driving Democrats in 2020 as opposed to 2016 is the desire to nominate a candidate who can beat Donald Trump. Far more than 4 years ago, when in the nominating process it was presumed whoever the Democrats nominated would likely beat Trump. Donald Trump is now the president, and there's a sense of urgency among voters to find somebody who can beat him. One factor that was not influential, despite what the media will tell you, is money, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. I'm then going to move in the second half of the talk to talk about the general election forecast in a very preliminary sense. I'll talk about the fundamentals and why, based on the fundamentals alone, this should be a very close race. But then I'll talk about some potentially compounding factors, most important of which is the coronavirus, and whether that is, for instance, going to make us vote by mail. And I'll show you some studies on the implications of voting by mail. I'll talk a little bit about the implications of the vice presidential choice in the aftermath of the Floyd killing and Joe Biden's promise to appoint a woman as vice president. There's now some pressure for him to appoint not just a woman, but a woman of color. And so I'll talk about some of the research on that. And then I'm very briefly going to touch on what I think the significance of this outcome of this presidential election is moving ahead. I'm going to talk primarily about the Democratic candidates whose rallies I went to. There actually was many more Democrats who threw their hat in the ring for the Democratic nomination. These are the candidates whose rallies I went to. I've divided them into 4 categories. On the left, appropriately enough, what I call the progressives: Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Beto, we hardly knew you, O'Rourke, all of whom, for instance, embraced wholeheartedly what we might call the Nordic model of the social welfare state. So state-provided healthcare, for instance, higher marginal tax rates, free college tuition for public schools, a variety of programs. Next to them, what I call traditional liberals. We should be clear here, they're often viewed as moderates, but compared to where Americans are in general, these liberals are not moderate, they are liberals, but they are liberals in a traditional sense. So for instance, on issues like healthcare, Biden and Klobuchar were willing to move left from where we are now, so fixing, amending, changing Obamacare, but still relying on private healthcare providers but a greater role for the United States government. Then the straddlers, those were individuals who at various incarnations of their political life were actually quite conservative. Think about Kamala Harris as an attorney general in California, noted for her record prosecuting criminals, or Cory Booker, who as a mayor in New Jersey was noted for embracing things like school choice and other policies that conservatives backed. But once he got into the nomination process, moved to the left. And finally, I'll just mention the long shots. And again, these are individuals that I categorize as long shots. Some of them were longer shots than others. Hello there, Marianne Williamson and John Delaney. Others were actually competitive, at least through the debate stage and some of the polling, like Andrew Yang and Julian Castro. There are a lot of other candidates that I could mention that I'm not going to. And the reason I mention the long shots here is because with retrospect, they're long shots. But when we started this race, nobody really had any idea how this field was going to shape up. And many of those candidates actually seemed pretty strong, or potentially strong. Okay, the most important thing you can think about when you're trying to assess the context in which the Democrats ran is the Democratic field. In fact, the nature of politics in the United States has shifted left in 4 years. And without going in and how we calculate this, this chart compares the ideological position of the last 4 Democratic nominees, that is John Kerry in 2004, Barack Obama 2008 and 2012, and Hillary Clinton in 2016, compared to the average ideological positioning of the major Democratic candidates in 2020. And you can see on this scale from 0 to 100, with 100 being most moderate, 0 most liberal, there's been a considerable shift to the left in the Democratic field. So that's the first thing. The Democrats are debating, or were debating, a set of issues that 4 years ago would have been viewed as beyond the realm of acceptable policy positions. For instance, moving towards a public option as the moderate position on healthcare, the idea that the national government, the US government, should provide health insurance as competition to the private marketplace. Obama tried to get that through in 2008. So much of what I was trying to do was try to take the temperature of Democratic voters. Unfortunately, here in the great state of New Hampshire, well, we're in Vermont right now, but next door to New Hampshire, we got a bird's eye view because almost every candidate seeking the nomination showed up there, and often attending these house parties. This is a particular house party from a former legislator from New Hampshire, who's been holding these for a number of years. I saw several candidates here. Wonderful bucolic event. You go here, you get to meet the candidates. You also met other people in my journey, like this is Phoenix, kid reporter. Phoenix was an actual media member. His father let him out of school for the year, and instead he went around from campaign to campaign. I first met him in a bar at a Tulsi Gabbard rally, and lo and behold, 2 months later, I was in Iowa, and I was talking to an Amy Klobuchar staffer. I turned around, there's Kid Phoenix, boy reporter. Of course, there are older reporters. This was a Klobuchar event in New Hampshire. I looked up next to me, and you guys should recognize him. Unfortunately, I had no idea that this was really one of the last campaign events. Poor Chris was sent to the sidelines for his past behavior in this era of Me Too sort of caught up with him. And of course, former students. This was at an HR rally that was in the middle as a former Middlebury student of mine who ended up being a staff assistant for Amy Klobuchar, and we stayed in touch. What the most amazing thing about this is if you look at Amy Klobuchar and see that face that she has right there, that is pasted on her. Anytime, one of the ubiquitous events at all of these rallies is candidates have to learn to take selfies with anybody who wants, and they have to look happy about doing it.
And she was the best I saw, Amy Klobuchar. That grin, that smile that said, this is the place that I want to be, never left her face in any selfie. I'll show you some more of those. And of course, those of you who followed me in Vermont, you couldn't escape my face on media, much to my chagrin. If you look behind my head, for instance, I did a lot of shots from my kitchen table, and people could see the progress of my living room ceiling repairs right behind my head there. You can see, used to be a hole there. All right, what happened? This is an aggregate poll of polls put out by Real Clear Politics. Each of those lines are trend lines from the left, the beginning of the nominating process, all the way through the end, pretty much the end of it on the right. And each line is the aggregate of several polls. And so think of it as the average poll of polls. And you can see from the beginning, Joe Biden, the green there, was viewed as the front runner. In fact, when he first announced that, he jumped up to about 41%. And Bernie, by virtue of recognition of having run in 2016, was often second in the polls. But the rest of the candidates, who were less well known, except Mayor Bloomberg, each of them went through what we call a period of surge, scrutiny, and ultimately decline. That is, when they first attracted attention, say for a debate moment, Kamala Harris very early on, look at her, that yellow surge right there very early on the left. That was after her first debate performance against Joe Biden, where she basically told the story of that young Kamala Harris who was bussed and was criticizing Biden for his opposition to bussing. And you can see she surged, and then you would have scrutiny. The media would begin looking at your record. In her case, she got a lot of pushback for her role as Attorney General in California, really alienated a lot of progressives, and her polling numbers began to drop. She also had a surge later. And this happened to a lot of candidates. Elizabeth Warren, a gradual jump up leading into the Iowa caucuses, and then she began gradually dropping off. She's the brown there. At the very end here, you see Michael Bloomberg, who just jumped in the race, and huge media blitz. That drove his polling up, but it wasn't enough to win any actual contests. A couple of other interesting ones there. Pete Buttigieg. Buttigieg coming out of Iowa, doing surprisingly well, sort of sustained that through New Hampshire and then just collapsed once he got out of the predominantly white states and headed into Nevada and then South Carolina. So you can see surge, scrutiny, and decline for a lot of these second-tier candidates. The two front runners consistently this whole time, Biden and Sanders. And for a brief period there, Joe Biden lost his polling lead. This was coming out of Iowa. You can see the moves ahead, and we're going to talk about what happens here. Remember, Biden in the beginning played the role of the front runner. He, in fact, was the first rally I went to in New Hampshire. On the left here was a farmer's market, and you could see Joe's bald head there. I couldn't get close to him at this time, and so I waited outside, and he drove by in his armored limo, and I said, "Hey, Joe, look at me." So he immediately looked the other way, and I snapped a picture anyhow. But if you went to the rally, Biden ran as a front runner. He almost never mentioned his other candidates. He only mentioned his, you might have thought his name was not Biden, but was O'Biden or Obama Biden, because every time he mentioned his own name, he paired it with Obama, sort of reminding people that he had been vice president for 8 years. And then he just attacked Trump. He said nothing about his opponents very early on. And as a result, he just began to lose support, a little bit of support, and the pundits began attacking him. Here I just present some email exchange I had with Ari Fleischer. Ari Fleischer, political pundit, runs Ari Fleischer Communications, a former Middlebury College student. And I had been saying, and I'll get to this in a moment, all along that people should not count Joe Biden out, even though he finished behind Sanders in the first three contests. And I kept saying, these aren't very good contest to judge him on, but most people sort of ignored me, understandably so, and adopted sort of Ari's perspective, which is Biden is dead. I predict he'll be dead after New Hampshire. He just won't admit it, and he'll be declared dead until after South Carolina. Remember, the media has a vested interest in what's new. That's why it's called the news, not the olds. And Biden was old news, and the media was not excited about his candidacy at all and was just looking for an alternative, which explains that surge in scrutiny. A lot of the second-tier candidates came out to New Hampshire, just staked out, stayed there for the longest time. This was a rally at Dartmouth College. That's John Hickenlooper, and that's his campaign manager, who kept begging me to ask John Hickenlooper a question because he was holding a media gaggle there, and there were only 3 of us, and I wasn't even part of the media. And these were the guys who were out there, you know, pounding the pavement, and you really had to admire them. They were long shot candidates. The other thing I would say, as sort of a preface to all of this, all of these candidates were incredibly impressive. You know, the Democrats had a very strong field. You might not know that the way the media would scrutinize their lack of polling and their support, but just very impressive people. One of them was John Delaney. Poor John Delaney was, by the way, that's my research assistant, the well-known Vermont politician next to him. You'll see a lot more of her in many of these pictures. Delaney, here he is at a retirement home, and he stayed there for 2 hours, and one individual in the front row kept peppering him with constitutional law questions, and bless his heart, he had no place else to go, and he stayed until the last question and got into his Delaney Real Solutions bus. Perhaps the first real surge in decline candidate was Beto O'Rourke, coming off his very long shot bid where he almost upset Ted Cruz in the Senate race. He suddenly became everybody's golden boy. Vanity Fair ran a wonderful piece on him. We went up to New Hampshire to see him up in the Lakes region. A very big, impressive guy. Drew a young crowd. His staffers were all about 18 to 21 years old. And there you could see him lining up for the selfie line. Beto was one of what I'd call the progressives, really moved left on healthcare, talked a lot about immigration, and played up his roots in Texas and his ability to reach out to the Latino vote, which is a huge growing vote. His basic argument was, my argument for getting the nomination is I can flip Texas. It did not work, and he dropped out very early. Another sort of long shot candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, the representative from Hawaii, who played up her military background. We first saw her in a bar in New Hampshire. This is where I met Kid Phoenix. Most eclectic crowd, a lot of military veterans from Vietnam really supporting her. And she talked about bipartisanship, her record as a legislator, very impressive candidate. Here she is later in New Hampshire, where she was asked point blank, why are you running? And it was a very probing question. It was asked by a 5-year-old. Here she is on the right, answering that 5-year-old's question about, why should I vote for you? Well, you can't, but that's okay. Mike Bennett, another impressive senator from Colorado. Here we are at a pizza joint, and you can't really tell, but there are literally 11 of us at this pizza joint, and he just bought pizza and beer for all of us. So you get my vote immediately. But the quintessential New Hampshire voter is just to his right. Look at that guy. He could be right out of the old Newhart show. And just a very good discussion. Julian Castro, the former mayor from San Antonio, became head of housing and urban development with Barack Obama and played that up really big. This is back at one of those house parties. And again, one of the more progressive candidates. And this guy came out of nowhere, Pete Buttigieg, Pete and repeat, since we saw multiple rallies by Pete, a small town mayor from South Bend, Indiana, who you have to see this guy in person to understand how phenomenal his speaking ability is. Of all the candidates we saw, he spoke in fully developed paragraphs. They just flowed without an, I wish I could lecture as effectively as this guy could give a campaign speech. And of course, he had a very interesting appeal. Obviously, the first openly gay Democratic candidate here that became a major contender for the nomination, and did not play that up much at all, except very obliquely, where he would make references to the importance for inclusive politics. And the other thing, of course, is his military record. And he became an early favorite of a lot of the media pundits, and I'll talk more about him later. There he is again with the well-known Vermont politician. Cory Booker, one of the candidates who moved to the left as he came out of New Jersey, where he's noted for his conservative policies, his bipartisanship, his ability to work with Republicans. He really moved left, really played up racial justice issues, and just never caught on. Very impressive candidate. I'm not sure why he never caught on, but he didn't. And of course, Mayor Bloomberg. Some of you may have gone up to Burlington to see him. He did not campaign in the early states. Had just a huge media blitz. I went up and saw him in Burlington. Talked a lot about his record as mayor, emphasizing education in particular, the importance of education policy and climate change policy. Then after the preliminaries, we went off to Iowa. Iowa, the first in the nation caucus, a state that is unrepresentative, and as a result, gets criticized by Democratic voters, particularly voters of color, is not suited to be the first contest in this nation, but nonetheless, it has jealously guarded that prerogative, and candidates, like it or not, have to go there. And the media typically overreacts to how people did here. And it is a caucus state, so it is tailor-made to Bernie Sanders. As the well-known politician is showing the t-shirt, Iowa, for some reason, you have to come here to be president. Who knows why, but that's the way the system works. And if you don't do well before Iowa, you go there to sell your books. Both Kamala Harris and Cory Booker were pretty much out of the race at this time. Everybody, woman on the left, is actually a major news correspondent for CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She grabbed me and tried to get me to explain what's going on. That woman in the middle there is Susan Sarandon. And when I mentioned this to my students, they said, Susan who? They've got no idea who Susan Sarandon is. Thelma and Louise, come on, where's your cultural reference? No clue. But she was there at this very famous bookstore. And I immediately went over there and said, I loved you in Thelma and Louise. Susan, would you sign anything? No, I actually didn't do that. I let her have her privacy, but I was tempted, very tempted. Iowa was crucial for a couple of candidates. One was Amy Klobuchar. Klobuchar from the Midwest, from Minnesota, was making the pitch that if she could win in the Midwest, she could retake those Midwestern states that Trump had flipped, in particular, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, which is going to be a state that is increasingly trending Republican in rural areas. So she was there. They were in the middle. And on the left, this is when we first got a sense that Buttigieg was taking off. That's a Buttigieg rally. He filled up a high school gym there. A lot of enthusiastic support for both Buttigieg and Klobuchar. We then attended, after a few days in Iowa, we went to the caucuses. You can go as an observer. And it is a phenomenon like nothing else. The Iowa residents take this seriously. About 18%, 16% of Iowa residents show up for the caucus. That may not seem like a lot compared to the 50% that vote in a New Hampshire primary, but this is a 2 to 3 hour affair that takes place on a weeknight. It's not a 5-minute vote. So people are really committed. You go into this room and here you see the Warren contingent. Each candidate has a contingent of voters. They hold their signs. Representatives come up, they give a little speech, and then the voters allocate themselves, and those who make the threshold, 15%, win delegates who then go on to the county level and the state level. It is an exercise in democracy, but it is a democracy that is limited to largely older, more affluent white voters. And this is where Bernie got his first shot of adrenaline. He was in the caucus we were at. He had by far the most organized group, the biggest group, and in fact, he won the statewide result. And immediately this was interpreted as trouble for Joe Biden. And going into New Hampshire, everybody said Biden has to win, like Ari Fleischer, or he is done. Meanwhile, I kept saying, no, Biden does not have to win New Hampshire. It's not a particularly good state for him. Most of his support is going to come from racial minorities, or let's put it this way, he's going to do much better among racial minorities than Bernie Sanders is. Sanders, we went to several rallies, and one thing we were noticing about Sanders' rallies compared to 2016, this was an ominous sign that the media was missing. He was not expanding his coalition. There weren't a lot of people at these rallies that I would go to, and I would say, you know, are you shopping around? No, everybody at Sanders' rallies were Sanders supporters. He was preaching to the converted, preaching to the choir. He wasn't bringing in new groups of people. Biden wasn't bringing in anybody, but I sort of had a feeling that Joe might do better when we got out of the solidly white states. And I kept warning people, Biden was, to me, was showing no evidence that he had expanded his coalition. Nonetheless, oh, by the way, I hadn't said much about Elizabeth Warren. She did okay in Iowa, but she really staked everything on her backyard neighboring state, New Hampshire, and she finished a distant fourth, and her candidacy was pretty well over. Although because she raised so much money, she stayed in a little bit longer, and I'll talk about her as one of the progressives as well. But she began to have a little back and forth with Bernie Sanders. They basically kept the gloves on for most of this time, and I think that hurt Elizabeth Warren. I think she really had, she did not. And in the end, there wasn't enough room in the progressive vote for both of them. So New Hampshire, there were a couple other candidates there. Andrew Yang, very impressive guy. His stump speech was much different than everybody else's. It focused on economic issues as opposed to sort of the cultural or the social issues that other Democrats were pushing on. And he really made an appeal for Trump voters, basically telling a story about the coming technological revolution. He would basically say this is the fourth revolution after the Industrial Revolution. And he got a lot of iconoclastic support in New Hampshire. Areas at Dartmouth, great sense of humor, very understated as well. Well, Bernie won New Hampshire, and the media played that up big, but I looked at it and I said, this is not good. He only won a quarter of the vote. Two surprise candidates here. Buttigieg, on the one hand, did okay in New Hampshire, even though this was a state tailor-made for him, but the one who really got momentum coming out of there was Amy Klobuchar, or as I called it, Clomentum. Suddenly she came out of nowhere, and there was a lot of sense that she may be about ready to bust the alternative Sanders and beat Biden here. The other thing here is Elizabeth Warren with 9% of the vote, huge disappointment. And of course, Joe Biden with 8% of the vote. He left on the day of the nominating contest, the primary contest. He just got out and headed to South Carolina. Buttigieg was hanging in there, although we didn't know this for sure, but his best days were behind him. Joe, of course, left town early. The well-known Vermont politician got within a whisker of getting a picture with Joe, and he just turned around and went in the other direction. Didn't help his support among the well-known Vermont politician. There he is leaving. Joe, come back. Then there was Nevada caucus, a caucus state. Again, caucus states well made for passionate supporters who can put 3 or 4 hours of a day in. This is why Bernie Sanders does so well, just as he did in 2016. He has very committed supporters. He wins Nevada, and Biden is a distant second. And this is really the handwriting on the wall for candidates like Buttigieg and Klobuchar, who's down there below Tom Steyer, because they were trying to show that they could draw support in a state that was not heavily white. And Nevada has a big Latino population, and they couldn't. And you sort of knew both of them began to recalibrate their chances heading into South Carolina. heading into South Carolina, all the pundits, this is 538, are anointing Bernie Sanders the front runner. Everybody but me. I'm saying, no way, he's in trouble. And I'm all over the media in Vermont saying Bernie Sanders is in trouble. And of course, I'm getting MASH notes and people are saying things about my ceiling. And we headed to South Carolina, where Elizabeth Warren, this was her last stand, and it was the last stand for Joe. Joe guaranteed he was going to win in South Carolina, but there were a lot of people doubting that. We went to several rallies there. One of the things Bernie did in South Carolina, which, remember, a plurality of the Democratic voters in South Carolina are voters of color, predominantly African American. Sanders trotted out a number of high-profile speakers, including one of his campaign managers, who are attempts to broaden his support among African Americans, because he knew he had to do well. This was his Achilles heel in 2016. Hillary won the nomination because of her support among African Americans. And it became clear while we were down there that Klobuchar and Buttigieg were in trouble. Here we are stopping at a Pete Buttigieg. This was his rally. This is where his headquarters was supposed to be. And I went into the bar with a well-known Vermont politician, and we said, we're here for the Buttigieg rally. And the waitress said, who is Buttigieg? Is he a rock star? So we knew he was in trouble. He knew he was in trouble. Klobuchar knew she was in trouble. And just before the primary was held, they all decided to endorse Joe. And along with Jim Clyburn, sorry, just after that, they endorsed. And that left Steyer and Warren hanging on here. Tom Steyer, I haven't mentioned much yet, the millionaire, billionaire from California, staked everything on South Carolina, literally moved down there, and ran on climate change, many issues, progressive issues, but really climate change. Very impressive guy. We met him multiple times down there. Perhaps the most surreal moment of this entire campaign was when we went to a historically black college in South Carolina because we wanted to talk to African-American voters. And it was a Steyer rally, and he went up with a hip hop duo and got on stage. And his wife, prior to that, did a rap song. This is his wife on the left there with the Tom button. Then Steyer got up there and began dancing with a well-known hip hop singer. It was it was amazing. He had the most fun of any candidate that we saw. But Biden won. We were at his victory rally, and you could just sense the relief in his voice, in part because James Clyburn, African-American politician, endorsed him heading in there and pulled a lot of weight. And this essentially ended the race. The pundits didn't know it at the time, but it just proved that Joe Biden's strength was exactly where Hillary Clinton's strength was, and his primary opponent, Bernie Sanders, could not win enough African-American votes to really be competitive. And you can see, here's the race. And we're looking at the blue is the person who won the contest. Don't be misled by Iowa. This is the delegates coming out of Iowa. Initially, Sanders would have had more delegates, but then as you move from the initial voting in the caucus up to the county, up to the state, we're not quite at the state yet, Biden was picking up delegates there. But you can see after New Hampshire and Nevada, we moved to South Carolina. And then on Super Tuesday, March 3rd, it's a clean sweep except for California and Utah and Vermont. All of them won by Bernie Sanders. Biden just cleaned up. And he cleaned up in particular with that southern tier of states that has very diverse voting population. The secondary Super Tuesday on March 10th, the same thing. Bernie's only able to win caucus states in North Dakota, and that's about it. As you can see, we move into April. In May, Bernie has essentially dropped out of the race, although he's still competing for delegates. And we're into June. with these remaining primaries left. Not that it'll matter, since Biden clinched the nomination with the total delegates. He needed about 1,900. He's got 2,144. So he is the presumptive nominee heading into the Democratic nomination. All right, why did he win? Two issues, race and electability. I've sort of hinted at that. Let me just show you some quick slides here. First, electability. Here is a slide in which candidates, the Democratic candidates, were characterized based on policy statements on how liberal they were. And again, the Democratic candidate's position is the blue line. That blue line is tracking the ideology of the Democratic candidate. If the blue line is low on your screen, it means they're very, very liberal. Think if you look here in the 1960s, you got Humphrey and you got McGovern and you got Carter, liberal Democrats. If they're conservative, they're on the right position, they're sort of near the top. Think about Bill Clinton. The red line is the share of the Republican Electoral College votes. And you can see there's an inverse relationship here. In other words, the more moderate the Democratic nominee, the worse the Republican candidate does in the general election. And this was, I think, the logic driving support for Biden. He was viewed as more moderate than Sanders, therefore more electable in a election year, 2020, in which there's huge concern about nominating somebody who can beat Trump. The second thing was race. And again, if you look here, you can see among white voters, Sanders and Biden, just looking at Super Tuesday, which really clinched the race, Biden won most of the white vote. But look at the black vote, 58% of it goes to Biden, only 18%. Sanders does do well among Hispanic Latino votes, although they're a smaller proportion. And Asian votes, he does quite well, but they're a very small proportion of the total vote here. If you look at just black voters, Super Tuesday, again, you can see the median support for Biden, 58% compared to Sanders and Bloomberg and Warren, distance 4 here. Why? I talked to black voters. Some of my students introduced me to African Americans in states down south. And the electability issue loomed large, and the fact that Biden was a Democrat and Bernie was not a Democrat. Bernie runs as a Democrat to win the nomination, but he's otherwise an independent. The Democratic label matters to African Americans because that is the party that provides services to them, that has helped them dating back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's the party, the fact that Biden is a long-standing card-carrying member of the Democratic Party matters to African Americans. And the fact that Bernie is not also matters to African Americans because the Democratic Party is the party that has helped African Americans the most. You can see Sanders did better among Hispanic or Latino voters. That helped him win California, Nevada, not enough to help him win Texas. All right. So if we look at the breakdown of the vote in the 2020 primary so far, again, Biden and Sanders close among the white voters and among other voters. And Sanders among Hispanic voters doing quite well, although not quite as well as Biden. But black voters, Bernie Sanders basically just did not draw more than 1 in 5 black voters, most of them going to Joe Biden. All right. And so those were the two issues. One thing I just want to quickly mention before I go to the general election here is that money didn't matter. Bernie Sanders was always touted as a strong candidate because of the amount of money he raised, and not just the amount of money he raised, but the small donors, which has always been used by the media as a proxy for how much support you have, how much support you can get from small donors, those who contribute in less than $200 increments. It is a misleading barometer, and I've said this repeatedly. Small donors are not representative of the electorate in general. And you should not be misled by the notion that small donors represent real Americans. They don't. They represent ideologically extreme Americans. So you can see not only did Sanders outraise Joe Biden, he outspent him considerably. But it's not enough. In the high-profile races, like a nominating contest, the amount of money that candidates raise beyond a certain level is sort of diminishing returns. You just can't spend it all. And Biden raised enough and had enough support from additional groups. Note again, we're looking here at small donors. Sanders and Warren ran away with the small donor contribution. That on the right is the fourth quarter 2019 small donors. And again, why? Because small donors gravitate towards the more ideologically extreme candidates. And you can see that's why Sanders and Warren draw the most support. But only about 3% of voters in general contribute money in small donations, give or take, depending on the election. So they are not representative of voters. They are more ideologically extreme. Sorts of campaign funds here, if you look at the campaign committee, by far, 75% of the contributions going to Sanders are so-called small donors, only about 40% of Joe Biden's, but it didn't matter. Biden raised enough money, small and large contributions, even though he was outraised by Sanders and outspent. All right, let me finish up by talking briefly about the general election and then opening this up to questions. Those of you who've heard me talk before, I have said that the general election, particularly the popular vote, is actually relatively easy is too strong a word, but it is something that political scientists have a handle on to the degree that we think sometime in September near Labor Day, looking at a few factors, we can make a pretty good guess what the general election outcome is going to be, particularly the popular vote, although we've taken a stab at the Electoral College vote. How can that be? Well, I'm not going to show you all the models because most of them aren't out yet, but I'm going to show you one, the Time for a Change model by political scientist Alan Abramowitz, and it's really based on three factors. One is the incumbent president or the incumbent president's party approval ratings. How popular is the incumbent president? Two, how long has the incumbent party held the White House? You get an added bonus if you've only held it one term, like Donald Trump has. If you've held it 2 terms, you actually get penalized by the voters. That's the time for change portion of the time for change model. And the third factor is the shape of the economy. Whether we measure this as Abramowitz does, by looking at change in gross domestic product, or other people look at change in disposable income. And the logic underlying this is when things are going well, as measured by support for the incumbent and the economy, people are going to stick with the party, unless that party has been in the White House for a long time. When things aren't going well, they're going to vote for the other out candidate. That's the essential logic behind these models. Now, this particular model, the Abramowitz model, also, in addition to the popular vote, predicts the Electoral College vote. In the first column there is the prediction of his model for the Electoral College vote. And again, this model comes out in mid-summer, before the debates, before any campaign advertising in the general election. And on the left is the actual total. And you can see the model is pretty good. It's not perfect. The Electoral College don't always match up identically to the predicted, but they're only off by 1 or 2 states, depending on the size of the state. This is pretty impressive. 3 factors, 3 variables can predict the Electoral College vote 3 or 4 months before the election even takes place. And again, it's because voters in the collective are not idiots. They vote with very simple heuristics, very simple cues. When things go well, reward the incumbent party. When they're not, we'll take a flyer on the alternative candidate. So what does that do for 2020? First of all, Donald Trump is not very popular. He's underwater by about 12% in the popular approval ratings. This is the question: do you disapprove of the job the president is doing? This is all of Trump's, and you can see the black is the number that approves of him, the red that disapproves. It's been pretty steady since really midway through 2017. There's been a slight drop recently as a result of some of the coronavirus impacting here, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. So right now, he's underwater by about 12 percentage vote. That is a factor that plays in to the model here that I'm going to show you, the time for a change model. The other factor is GDP. So back in March, based on first quarter GDP rating before the coronavirus kicks in, and Abramowitz did a first run of his model. And he says, basically, it's going to be a dead heat. I can't choose between Trump and his opponent. Why? Trump's approval rating is about -10. Pretty close to where it is now. Real GDP growth is about 1 to 2%. The economy was expanding slowly, but it was expanding, and it had been for a number of years. And based on that and the fact that the Trump administration was the first term for a Republican Party, the model predicted that he would receive, Trump, between 263 and 283 electoral votes. Well, it takes 270 electoral votes to win, so that bracket is bracketing Trump losing by a few votes or winning by a few votes, right? In other words, given the margin of error with these models, we saw the margin of error here. Abramowitz said, I can't predict who's going to win. It's going to be a dead heat, a close call. Anything could tip the scales. That was before the coronavirus. Here's this model. Now, we're looking at 1 to 2% second quarter GDP growth. We're looking at net approval of -10. You can see the variation on the left-hand column, 263 electoral votes to 283, bracketing that 270. But what happens? Look at GDP actually in the first month, January into February, in March, the first quarter. It falls off a cliff. Not only are we not at 0, which is what his model said Trump would lose, we're at -5. Now, at -5, it should be a landslide. Trump should have no chance if this model sustains through the second quarter. That is, if GDP growth continues to be bad. As another model that uses a similar thing says, the coronavirus will cause Trump to suffer a historic defeat in November. This is a different model, same idea. The model uses unemployment, disposable income, and inflation to forecast election results. It predicts Trump will win 35% of the popular vote. I'm not showing you the Abramowitz model because I've already showed it to you, but this is another one that incorporates the reduced GDP. Prior to this model predicted Trump would win 55% of the vote, higher than Abramowitz's, because it's based only on the economy. It ignores approval ratings. So if Trump gets 35% of the popular vote, it would be the worst performance for an incumbent in a century. The question is, should we trust the models? And partly the reason I'm going to hedge here is because Trump has some strengths. He has a ton of money, so he's going to be able to advertise. Again, in the general election, generally speaking, you only need a certain amount of money, and everything above that is diminishing returns. I don't think the money is going to help Trump so much as the possibility that this coronavirus is going to begin to recede. And if it recedes, and do I have that slide? I do not have that slide. Okay. I thought I would have that slide. Ah, here it is. The alternative perspective, and a lot of Republicans are holding on to this. In interviews with more than 50 state, district, and county Republican Party chairs, they think the landscape is actually not only not suggesting a landslide for Biden, but instead a landslide for Trump. And the reason is they think the coronavirus is on its way. The economy has begun loosening the restrictions, will begin roaring back, and we saw The most recent jobs number was phenomenal relative to what was expected. It was the biggest one-month jump recorded. It's still pretty dismal, but it's trending in the right direction. And Biden, according to Republicans, is a historically weak candidate, too frail to last. And once you get outside the media market, the sort of the Washington, D.C., New York Times, New York City, LA Times, left coast, and get in there in the heartland, support is much greater than what the media thinks it is. Which one of these scenarios is going to come true? Gloria will have to invite me back. Hedge on this at Labor Day, and we'll have a much better idea. Let me finish by talking about some broader topics here. Here's the head-to-head between Trump and Biden right now. You can see Biden is leading Trump in most polls, the poll of polls, by about 8%. That sounds pretty impressive, except when you think about a comparison, for instance, to 2016. Right now, that top line is 2016 through mid-June, and it showed Hillary Clinton, average Democratic lead after 44 was 5.7 percentage points. Right now, 2020 through mid-June, the average of 72 polls is 5.9. In other words, Joe Biden right now is doing about as well as Hillary Clinton in the polling did at this time in 2016. Moreover, we know Trump actually got closer to Clinton as we went closer to the election in 2016. Now, the difference is Trump has an election record that he has to defend. And in 2016, it was an unknown quantity. He really didn't have a record, and people could just sort of read anything they wanted. Now we know what kind of a candidate he is because we know what kind of a president he is. So it's not clear that this comparison is going to hold apples to apples. The other thing we've got to look at is the turnout among Black voters. So here is the Black presidential vote, and you can see the tipping point was 1964 when Barry Goldwater got the Republican nomination. This was right after the Civil Rights Act was passed. The Civil Rights Act, followed up by the Voting Rights Act in '65. And Goldwater was sort of running this sort of Republican minimal government thing, and African-American votes, which was leaning Democratic until that time, just went skyrocketing and has stayed through the roof. Through 2012, you can see 2012, obviously it peaked with Barack Obama. But here's the thing. Hillary Clinton, although she won the same proportion of Black vote, roughly 90%, as Obama did, she did not turn out Blacks in 2016. Actually, the Black vote declined from where it was in 2012. And that cost her in key states like Wisconsin, like Michigan, like Pennsylvania. That cost her in Electoral College. If you look at turnout from 2012 to 2016, and you look at white, non-college educated voters, you can see they jumped up by 3%. They were key in those states. African Americans dropped by about 5%, 4.5. Even though the overall composition of the voting pool among all voters, the proportion that was white and non-college educated actually declined from 2012 to 2016, but their turnout rate, even though the overall number of them was a smaller proportion of the electorate, they turned out in higher numbers. And that was enough in a close election to flip those key states and give this to Donald Trump. And the question is, are African Americans going to turn out? Right now, as you can see, they're overwhelmingly supporting Joe Biden, 81% supporting him in this poll compared to 3% for Trump. So if they turn out, this will help Biden. But the question is, will they turn out? Can Biden bring them? I know I've gone about an hour here, a little less. So let me quickly finish up with a couple of other issues and throw this open to questions. and I apologize for the length here. The vice presidential choice. Biden has made a historic promise to select a woman. Here are a number of women that are being considered. Conspicuous by her absence here is Amy Klobuchar, who was the front runner until recently because she was a woman who could bring those Midwest states. Why is she no longer considered one of the front runners? Because of the George Floyd shooting. The race element has become elevated, and Biden is under tremendous pressure, not just to nominate a woman, but to nominate a woman of color. And this has elevated the profile of Kamala Harris, Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida, Stacey Abrams, who made an unsuccessful bid to win in Georgia. And again, there are other women who are being considered, but Klobuchar is suddenly, because of her record as a prosecutor in Minnesota, she's being viewed as perhaps damaged goods now, because they need somebody, a vice president, who can appeal to African-American voters. Does the vice presidential choice matter? This was studied in an interesting book by Chris Devine and Kyle Kopko, and they basically found it does not change, at least it has not historically changed the vote. Basically, it is important in signaling to the electorate what the president believes in, but the individual choice of a vice presidential candidate is not going to affect the electoral college. At least that's what this study shows. Finally, what if we go to voting by mail? Donald Trump has been significantly opposed to this. Here's a tweet from him about mail-in ballots will be fraudulent, mailboxes will be robbed, ballot boxes will be stuffed and illegally printed. Get the facts about mail-in ballots. And this reflects the conventional wisdom in both parties that a surge of mail ballots is going to favor the Democrats. What does the research show? The logic behind this is most absentee ballots are typically cast by Republicans. So if you have a big turnout in absentee ballots, that's going to help the Democrats. Why? Because you're going to draw disproportionately from individuals who previously did not vote. That is, individuals who are less wealthy, less educated, they lean Democrat. In fact, there is no evidence that that's true, even though more Democrats than Republicans support mail-in voting. Here you can see a survey. Blue line is Democrats, red is Republicans. You can see mail-in voting and no excuse absentee voting has much stronger support among Democrats than Republicans, again, feeding this perception that it will help Democrats. But in fact, a very well done study of 3 states that now have mail-in voting, actually there's 6, but this study, 3 states that moved to, from in-person voting with partial mail-in to entirely mail-in voting, found it did not help either party. And I can talk about the reasons why that is, but we're already running long. So let me finish with this point. One thing that we're interested in is mandates. The idea is if a candidate wins an overwhelming number of votes, presidential candidate, he can claim a mandate. He has capital. He can wield that electoral margin the way Ronald Reagan did in 1980 to bully the Democrats and Tip O'Neill in the House into allowing Reagan to push his policy agenda. Here's the problem. 1980 was probably the last time that we had a mandate. Here on the left, we've broken presidential elections from 1920 to 1956 and compared that from 1980 to 2016. In the first period, the period of mandates, the average margin of victory was 342 electoral college votes. And the popular vote was 56.2% of the overall national vote. For the winning candidate, that is a substantial margin. More recently, since 1980, the average margin of victory in the Electoral College has dropped, and that's averages. You can see that there are some landslides like Reagan in 1980, that are distorting those averages. If you take that out, and you take its 1984 out, in 1988, George Bush's, it's really becomes closer. And the median vote is 50.7%. It's almost a toss-up since 1980. And as a result, we're in this current period of enhanced partisan polarization and conflict and a lack of a mandate. Instead, presidents are winning, and Donald Trump in 2016 exemplifies this when he won the presidency fair and square in the Electoral College, even though he finished behind in the popular vote. You have no mandate at all. It's a negative mandate. It's negative coattails, and it means your opponents can spend the next 4 years litigating your presidency or going even further and trying to remove you through impeachment or appointing a special prosecutor. And so the worry we have heading into 2020 is if Joe Biden wins, but by a very narrow margin, or Donald Trump wins re-election, but again, squeaking through, we are in for another 4 years of partisan polarization and excessive conflict. And that's really not a good place for this country to be. All right, I went almost exactly an hour. Let's take questions. I'm gonna let Gloria handle this, and glad to jump in.
Okay, first question. Thank you, Matt, by the way. It was wonderful. First question, it's clear that Biden will need to have strong people around him, but are you confident he will choose people based on the merits as opposed to factors like gender and race, which he already has said are his main criteria for VP and Supreme Court?
Yeah, great question. And again, you dance with them who brung you, or something like that. The idea here is the Democratic coalition is a diverse coalition. Obviously, the vice presidential choice is a reflection in part of where the dialogue of the nation is right now. I talked about the importance of bringing the African Americans here, particularly after the Floyd shooting. The question is, will that sort of emphasis on racial dynamics and identity politics permeate the rest of Biden's choices? You know, historically, Barack Obama, for instance, had a very diverse White House. I suspect Biden is going to choose individuals who represent the Democratic coalition, but that doesn't mean they're not qualified. So the question sort of presumes an either or. We take people who are qualified, or we take people who represent particular ethnic or racial groups. You can do both. And I suspect Joe Biden is going to sort of follow the Barack Obama model here in getting a racially, ethnically diverse team and gender diverse. The other thing I would talk about, and I won't go into much detail here, one of the most important decisions that the president has to make, and I won't talk about the Senate, is court nominations, Supreme Court nominations. And again, Democratic presidents have tended to choose a much more diverse body of nominees to the courts, and I expect that to continue with Biden.
Okay, next question. How do you feel Kamala Harris is viewed in communities of color, especially regarding her law enforcement background?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons she got in trouble very early on, as that record, she was not trusted by progressives. Even in particular, progressives in communities of color, because of her law enforcement background. She tried to tack to the left, but her record is what her record is. And that's one of the things Biden is going to have to sort of grapple with here. And that may be in that list of qualities I mentioned. That was one of her weaknesses. I think it is going to play a consideration. And again, when you move from the primaries to the general election, you tend to move from a more leftist voting coalition among Democrats to a general election where it's a little more moderate. Biden may calculate that law enforcement credentials actually may shore up his support among centrists. So I don't think it's as big a liability for Harris in the general election as it was in the Democratic nomination.
Doesn't a VP candidate make a much bigger difference when the candidate is 77?
Yeah, well, we've seen evidence of this when John McCain chose Sarah Palin, for instance. It sort of reminded people, my God, John McCain is a relatively older candidate and somebody who has health questions, and to choose a woman who was viewed as, you know, even though she had some very striking qualities, she wasn't viewed as particularly experienced. So yeah, I think if you're going to be the oldest president ever elected, as Joe Biden will be, and there are the whispering campaign, like it or not, about his health, I think it is going to be magnified. So when we talked about the research showing that in general, the choice of a vice president doesn't affect the election, that's a general finding across the last, I think it goes back 80 years. But it doesn't mean that in any particular race, that choice might play a bigger electoral component than it would in other years. I still don't think it's going to be the deciding factor, but certainly people are going to pay a little bit more attention to it because of Joe Biden's age and concerns about his health. What that means, for instance, I think, is it might be difficult to choose a vice presidential candidate who is, you know, in her early 70s, like an Elizabeth Warren. You might want somebody who's in their 50s.
Okay. How much will events of the last 3 weeks affect Black turnout? Might it be decisive for Biden?
It could be. One of the things that campaigns do, despite our forecast models predicting turnout and results before the general election campaign starts, a good campaign makes a narrative about what the campaign is about in a way that favors your candidacy and hurts the other candidacy. And the Floyd, and not just Floyd, but the series of police shootings and the impact it's had on public opinion and the agenda and the debate, it is conceivable that Biden can work this into a narrative in a way that helps him among African Americans and hurts among Trump supporters. It hurts Trump among African American voters. We'll have to see how this plays out. I mean, part of the problem here is there is a hidden potential for backlash. There is a significant component of voters in those key electoral college states who we saw in 2016, particularly middle to lower income, predominantly white voters, who are, like it or not keen on what they view as racial politics. So the difficulty with the Democratic coalition is that African Americans are disproportionately located in areas that vote predominantly Democratic. And they're not well distributed in those key electoral college states, like a Wisconsin or a Minnesota. So a lot of it depends not only whether this racial divide drives African Americans, but where it drives African American votes. Not going to do much good if you have a huge turnout of African Americans in California or New York, right? And it may not help him in many southern states. But if you can get a bigger turnout in Milwaukee or Philadelphia, you could flip some of these states that went for Donald Trump in 2016.
What about potential complacency of the voters as there was in 2016? Many thought Clinton was an easy winner and just did not show up.
Yeah, I saw this clearly in the nominating process that in 2016, where I did the same type of thing, the assumption was whoever won the nomination was going to be the nominee, whoever won the Democratic nomination was going to be the general election winner. There wasn't a lot of sense of urgency once Hillary Clinton won. And a lot of, I think in particular, younger voters and African Americans stayed home. And I'm not seeing that in 2020. In 2020, there was a sense of urgency among Democratic voters to beat Donald Trump and to get him out of office. Whether that urgency will translate into higher turnout and whether Trump can counteract that by mobilizing his base, it remains an open question. But I suspect turnout is going to be up Remember, in 2012 to 2016, overall turnout dropped by about 3%, from about 61% to about 58%. I suspect it's going to go back up closer to 61%. But a lot of this depends on Joe Biden's ability to mobilize those base voters that stayed home in 2016.
The chance Trump will use the virus or some other excuse to cancel or postpone the election is if he's far behind in the polls. What is the chance there will be a massive concerted attempt by Republicans to prevent as many likely Democrat voters from voting?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Laura.
One more. What is the chance that Trump will declare fraud if he loses and sends the verdict to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, this is a worry that I've heard aired. I am very skeptical. Not that Trump is not going to claim fraud and voter suppression efforts aren't going to take place. Again, to be fair to Republicans, they do not call this voter suppression. They call it fighting against voter fraud. Now, there is not a lot of evidence that there is voter fraud. Having said that, for instance, vote by mail is more susceptible to voter fraud than voting in person. How much more susceptible? States that have moved to voter by mail have not seen discernible increases in vote by mail. But nonetheless, if we did an all vote by mail and Donald Trump lost a close election, yeah, he's going to claim fraud. He's going to claim, I'm almost certain of this. Do voter ID laws disproportionately affect Democratic voters? They do, mostly because they disproportionately affect individuals who are lower income, lower educated, who have to navigate. And again, I've talked about this in the context of Vermont. With the media, Republicans think on principle, voting is not a guarantee, it's a privilege, and individuals should make the effort to acquire whatever ID they need to do and go vote. Having said that, I believe there is no chance, none, that the election will be invalidated. Donald Trump may claim, but he doesn't control the election. The election is controlled at first at the state and local level. It's just not going to happen, folks. This idea that he's going to call out the military and stay in office, you have more important things to worry about than the idea that somehow Donald Trump is going to prevent an election outcome from being implemented. It's just not going to happen.
Let's see, another question. Which states do you believe will have the greatest success in minority suppression?
Well, states, if by minority suppression you mean the impact of voting ID laws, generally speaking, and again, the voting ID laws, whether you call it conscious suppression or efforts on principle, whatever the motive is, we know that typically they're supported by Republicans. So those states in which Republicans control the livers of voter eligibility and are probably going to show higher levels of the impact of voter ID laws. But again, I wouldn't go too far down that rabbit hole about thinking this election is going to turn on quote unquote voter suppression. There was an argument that this happened in 2016, and the data on this is very, very sketchy. There's just a lot of other factors that are going to come into play here.
And this may be the final question. So aren't there at least two significant aberrations that make comparisons with 2016? For example, the polls just before the election less reliable, namely Comey's announcement 11 days before the election, there was new information about Hillary's emails, and Hillary's failure to campaign in the 3 swing states just before the election.
Yeah.
And for example, her overconfidence not likely to be repeated by Biden in 2020.
Yeah. So, it's very difficult to assess in a reliable method an alternative history. but and I'm not going to go into the detail on this, but our best, and this is, I don't expect everybody to believe this, but our best estimate is the Comey announcement had no impact on the outcome of the vote. And the reason is that in the last few days, typically the vote breaks, the undecided voters typically break for the challenger. And if you look at past presidential elections and the size of that break, it was no different in 2016. So I don't think the Comey announcement had any impact on 2016, although I know it's an article of faith among Clinton supporters and among Clinton, not only her supporters, but her. She thinks it did. And, you know, there are some pundits like 538 that said it did. Political scientists don't think it did. Having said that, can there be a so-called black swan event, you know, a hurricane, anything that affects turnout can potentially sway an election depending on where that turnout is affected. Campaigns matter. They matter, once, by creating a framing narrative about an election, and two, about turnout. And there is an argument to be made. It's very tough to test that Hillary Clinton's failure to campaign, the last 100 days, she didn't go to Wisconsin at all. Her failure to do that, and reliable sources say her husband was urging her to get out there and particularly target those white middle to lower income voters, and she didn't do it. You know, it is hard to say with any sense of confidence whether that cost her. My instinct tells me it did. And I think, you know, again, both candidates have to make choices on where they're going to allocate their time and when they're going to allocate it. It's an inexact science here. They have the best campaign strategists working for them. And, you know, I'm always under the assumption that both sides are equally well matched in allocating resources and choosing which states to run in, which is why we can usually dismiss the impact of campaign events, because both sides sort of cancel each other out, and it's sort of the fundamentals that drive the election. But if one candidate is disproportionately better than others, or if one side makes a mistake, as potentially Hillary Clinton did, that in a close election could change the dynamics. The thing I would leave you with is 3 months ago, we would have said this is going to be a toss-up election. Right now, if history is any guide, this is not going to be a toss-up election. Where are we going to be 3 months from now? I don't know. You don't know. I don't think anybody knows. It depends a lot on whether the economy takes off again and how we deal with the coronavirus. And that's what makes this election cycle so nerve-wracking and so difficult to predict. And why I hope Gloria invites me back sometime in October, when some of these questions I think I'll have a better shot at answering.
Well, we'd love to have you back. Thank you so much for being a part of this Zoom presentation. And I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us here for this lecture tonight. And I hope to see you next week for whistleblowers and for many of the other programs we offer this summer and fall. Thank you very much.
And Gloria, can I make one quick plug? For those of you who are interested, I do a weekly politics luncheon. Just send me your email address, and it's all by Zoom, and you feel free to join in. And I will put you on the distribution list if you send me an email.
Great.
That's Dickinso at Middlebury. It's showing right up there on your screen. And I want to thank Gloria again for hosting this. Thank all of you. I hope you all had a cocktail in hand and you can get out and enjoy the good weather.
Okay, have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.